Dave, Mitchell took a deep breath as he stood in front of the grand, old gates of Oak Ridge Academy. It was his second day as the school's janitor, and although he had braced himself for this new chapter, there was still a lingering nervousness in his chest. For years, he had worked at a prestigious luxury hotel, scrubbing marble floors that gleamed under expensive chandeliers, attending to the messes of wealthy guests who barely acknowledged his presence. But no matter how well he did his job, he was treated as invisible at best and disposable at worst. The last straw had been when a manager, irritated with Dave's insistence on fair treatment, had made it his mission to push him out. Rather than enduring any more, Dave had quit. This job at Oak Ridge Academy was supposed to be different, a fresh start. He didn't need recognition or praise. He just wanted peace, a job he could do in relative quiet, without the weight of unfair expectations crushing him. As he walked through the school grounds, mop and bucket in hand, he found himself absorbing the atmosphere. The bright, colorful posters along the hallways encouraged students to be kind, to dream big, to stand up for what was right. He hoped that these weren't just empty words. Out on the playground, the sounds of children laughing filled the crisp morning air. Groups of students ran around playing tag, kicking soccer balls, or chattering about their favorite cartoons. As he worked near the swings, some of the kids approached him, asking simple, innocent questions. "Are you new here? Do you clean the whole school? Can I try using the mop?" Their curiosity was refreshing, and for the first time in a long while, Dave felt something warm settle in his chest. Children didn't carry the same biases as adults. To them, he was just someone new, someone doing his job. But then, as his eyes scanned the playground, his gaze landed on a young girl standing alone. She was small, with tight, dark curls and deep brown skin. Unlike the other children, who ran and laughed, she stood quietly near the fence, gripping the straps of her backpack as if they were her only source of comfort. Her name was Layla. He hadn't noticed her before, but now that he had, he couldn't ignore her. There was something unmistakably familiar in the way she stood. Shoulders slightly hunched, as if trying to make herself smaller, eyes darting around cautiously, as though expecting something bad to happen at any moment. The school bell rang, and the children rushed inside, chattering excitedly about the day ahead. Layla, however, hesitated. She lingered at the edge of the playground, staring at the entrance as if stepping inside was the most terrifying thing in the world. A woman stood by the door, her teacher, presumably. Arms crossed, foot tapping impatiently, her expression hardened as soon as she spotted Layla. "You're late again, Layla." The girl's fingers tightened around her backpack straps, and without a word, she shuffled inside. Dave frowned. Something about the interaction didn't sit right with him. Later that morning, he found himself cleaning the cafeteria when Layla accidentally knocked over her milk carton. The white liquid spread quickly across the table, and a few kids nearby giggled, whispering to each other. Layla's face burned with embarrassment, and she hurried to clean it up with her sleeve, but Dave was faster. He placed a napkin in front of her. "It's okay," he said gently. "Everybody spills something sometimes." Layla hesitated before accepting the napkin. She glanced up at him, wary but grateful. "Thank you," she whispered. That small exchange was enough for Dave to realize something. This little girl wasn't just shy. She wasn't just quiet. Something was wrong. Over the next few days, Dave began paying closer attention to Layla. He quickly noticed a pattern. She was always the last to enter the classroom, her steps slow and reluctant. She never played with the other children at recess, instead choosing to sit by herself, staring at the ground. At lunch, she picked at her food, her eyes constantly flicking toward the teachers as if waiting for something unpleasant to happen. Then, one morning, while cleaning near the faculty lounge, he overheard a conversation that made his stomach twist. "She's still struggling to fit in, huh?" one teacher asked. "I'm not surprised," another replied. "She's different from the other kids. You can tell she doesn't belong here." Dave felt his grip tighten on the mop handle. Different. Doesn't belong. He had heard those words before, directed at him, at people like him. Words that didn't sound outright cruel, but carried a weight far heavier than any slur. The pieces were coming together. His suspicions deepened later that day when he saw something that made his blood run cold. Principal Warren, the school's headmaster, was gripping Layla's wrist tightly as he led her down the hallway. She didn't resist, but the way she held herself, the tension in her tiny frame, the way her free hand balled into a fist, spoke volumes. Dave subtly moved closer, pretending to wipe a nearby window. "I've warned you about this, Layla." The principal's voice was quiet but firm. "I don't want to see this kind of behavior again." Layla said nothing, eyes cast downward. After a few more murmured words, Principal Warren let go of her wrist and walked away, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. Layla remained standing there, unmoving, for several moments before she finally exhaled and walked toward her classroom. Dave's gut twisted. That wasn't just discipline. That was intimidation. Determined to find out more, Dave approached Sarah, the school's receptionist. She had been working at Oak Ridge Academy for years and was known for knowing everything that happened within its walls. "Hey, Sarah," he started casually. "What's the deal with Principal Warren?" She hesitated, then glanced around before lowering her voice. "He's strict, stricter than the last principal. A lot more students have been getting detention since he took over." Dave nodded. "What about the janitors before me?" Sarah's expression darkened. "They didn't last long." That made Dave pause. "Why?" he pressed. Sarah sighed. "Some quit. Some were fired for, well, let's just say questionable reasons. One of them even told me that Warren didn't like certain people working here." Dave's jaw clenched. He knew exactly what that meant. That afternoon, as he passed through the cafeteria, he saw Layla sitting at a far table by herself, stirring her soup absent-mindedly. He approached her slowly. "Hey, kiddo, how was your day?" Layla hesitated before answering. "The principal doesn't want me here." Her voice was so small, so fragile, yet the weight of those words hit Dave like a punch to the gut. He crouched beside her, keeping his voice gentle. "Did he say that to you?" Layla nodded. "Did you tell anyone?" She shook her head. "No one would believe me." Dave exhaled, the anger simmering in his chest. He had spent his whole life being ignored when he spoke up about injustice, being dismissed when he pointed out unfairness. He knew exactly what Layla was feeling, but this time, he wouldn't let silence win. "I believe you." And in that moment, he made a silent promise. He would find out the truth, and he would make sure Layla was safe. The more Dave observed, the clearer it became. Layla wasn't just being ignored. She was being deliberately singled out. One morning, while cleaning near her classroom, he overheard a commotion. Through the open door, he saw Layla standing stiffly at her desk while another girl, a blonde-haired student named Emma, sat nearby, looking smug. Their teacher, Miss Freya, stood between them, arms crossed in clear disapproval. "Layla, this is the third time this week you've caused trouble," Miss Freya said, her voice laced with irritation. "I didn't," Layla started, but the teacher cut her off. "No excuses. Go stand outside until I say you can come back in." Layla swallowed hard and did as she was told, stepping out into the hallway. Dave could see her blinking rapidly, trying to hold back tears. Meanwhile, Emma remained seated, glancing at a few of her classmates with a victorious smirk. Miss Freya turned back to her lesson without so much as a reprimand for Emma. Dave clenched his fists. He had seen enough. He waited until Miss Freya left the classroom momentarily before approaching Layla. "Hey, what happened in there?" he asked, keeping his voice low. Layla wiped her nose and whispered, "Emma threw a pencil at me. I told her to stop, and she said I was lying. Then Miss Freya got mad at me instead." Dave exhaled sharply. It was exactly what he had suspected. Layla wasn't just ignored. She was punished for simply existing. This was beyond unfair. This was systematic. "That wasn't right," Dave said, his tone firm but kind. "You didn't do anything wrong." Layla looked up at him, her deep brown eyes filled with uncertainty. "Then why does everyone act like I did?" "Because the system was broken. Because some people saw a child like her and decided she was trouble before she even spoke. Because adults like Miss Freya and Principal Warren thought no one would question them when they made her life miserable." Dave took a deep breath. He had to be careful. If he spoke out too openly, he could lose his job before he had the chance to help Layla. But he wasn't going to stay silent. Not this time. That afternoon, Dave saw Layla sitting alone at lunch again. She was pushing a spoon through her mashed potatoes, not eating, not even pretending to. He grabbed a rag, pretending to wipe down a nearby table, and sat across from her. "Mind if I sit here?" She shrugged. They sat in silence for a while before Dave spoke again. "Layla, I need to ask you something important." She looked up cautiously. "Has Principal Warren done anything else to you? Anything that made you feel unsafe?" Layla's fingers gripped the edge of her tray, her whole body tensing. She hesitated for so long that Dave almost thought she wouldn't answer. But then, in a voice so quiet he barely heard it, she whispered, "He doesn't let me go in the classroom until all the white kids are inside first." Dave felt his entire body go rigid. "What?" Layla nodded, her small hands trembling. "He makes me wait outside. He says it's the rule." Dave's heart pounded. He had suspected discrimination, but this was outright segregation. "Layla, that's not a rule," he said, his voice tight with anger. "That's wrong. You know that, right?" She looked away. "I don't know. He's the principal. Everyone listens to him." Dave swallowed back his fury. Of course she didn't know. She was a child being conditioned to accept mistreatment as normal. "Listen to me," he said, leaning in slightly. "You belong in that classroom just as much as anyone else. You don't have to follow rules that are meant to hurt you." Layla didn't respond, but he could see the emotions warring in her eyes. Fear, doubt, and maybe, just maybe, a sliver of hope. Dave didn't say anything else. He just gave her a nod, as if silently promising her something. He would fix this, one way or another. That evening, as Dave was finishing up his work, he saw something that made his stomach turn. Layla was walking down the hallway, her backpack slung over one shoulder, when Principal Warren appeared. "Layla," Warren called. His voice was smooth, but there was an edge to it. Layla stopped immediately. Dave wasn't sure what made him pause, but something about the way she flinched when she heard her name sent warning bells through his mind. Warren walked toward her, his large frame looming over her tiny one. He placed a hand on her shoulder, too firm, too controlling. "Come with me for a moment," he said. Layla hesitated but nodded. Dave didn't like it. Not one bit. Warren led her toward the girls' bathroom. Dave frowned. Why would he take her there? Something was wrong. He picked up a rag and moved toward the bathroom, pretending to clean nearby. He positioned himself just close enough to hear, but not close enough to be noticed. At first, there was silence. Then, a muffled voice. Then, a stifled whimper. Dave didn't think. He moved. He rushed toward the bathroom door just as it slammed open. Layla burst out, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. Her tiny chest rose and fell rapidly as she gasped for breath. Dave caught her before she could stumble. "Layla? What happened?" Tears welled in her eyes, but before she could answer, Warren stepped out of the bathroom. His expression was unreadable. He smoothed down his tie, eyes flicking from Layla to Dave. "There seems to be a misunderstanding," Warren said, his voice cool. "Layla was misbehaving. I had to discipline her." "Discipline?" Dave looked at Layla, her shaking hands, the way she was clutching his sleeve like a lifeline. Rage flooded his veins. He had seen enough. Principal Warren had crossed a line, and Dave wasn't going to let him get away with it. Dave wrapped an arm around Layla protectively as she clung to him, her small body trembling against his side. The hallway had started to fill with curious students and teachers, their murmurs rising like waves in the background. Principal Warren's cold eyes swept over the growing crowd, his jaw tightening as he straightened his tie. "There's nothing to see here," Warren announced, his voice smooth and authoritative. "Layla was being disruptive, and I was merely addressing the issue." Dave could feel Layla's tiny fingers gripping his sleeve even tighter. She was terrified. He knew, without a doubt, that if he didn't speak now, no one else would. "That's a lie," Dave said, his voice steady but firm. A ripple of gasps echoed down the hall. No one spoke to the principal like that. Warren's eyes narrowed. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," Dave said, shifting slightly to keep Layla shielded from the man's imposing presence. "I saw her run out of that bathroom, scared out of her mind. I heard something before she came out, something that didn't sound like discipline. The students and teachers exchanged uneasy glances. No one dared to speak, but they were listening. Warren forced a chuckle. "Mr. Reynolds, I suggest you stick to your job and leave school matters to the professionals." Dave squared his shoulders. "My job is to make sure this school is a safe place for kids. And right now, she doesn't feel safe." Layla's fingers twitched against his sleeve. "That's ridiculous," Warren scoffed. "Layla has had a history of behavior issues." "That's not true." The voice was small but firm. "Layla." The entire hallway went still. Dave looked down at her, his heart pounding with both pride and concern. She took a deep breath, her little hands balled into fists. "I didn't do anything wrong. He's been keeping me out of class. He doesn't want me here." The tension in the air was thick, heavy. Dave could see the flicker of panic in Warren's eyes, though the man quickly masked it with feigned outrage. "That's enough," Warren snapped. "This conversation is over." "No," Dave countered, stepping forward. "It's just getting started." The principal's face darkened. And then, "What's going on here?" A new voice cut through the tension. It was Mrs. Caldwell, a school board representative. She had been visiting the school that day for an evaluation, and she had just walked into a storm. Mrs. Caldwell's sharp eyes scanned the scene, quickly taking in the frightened girl clinging to Dave, the defensive stance of Principal Warren, and the hushed but growing whispers among the gathered students and teachers. "Someone better start explaining," she said, crossing her arms. Warren was the first to speak. "Mrs. Caldwell, I apologize for the disruption. This janitor," he shot Dave a glare, "has overstepped his bounds and is causing unnecessary alarm. Layla was misbehaving, and I was simply handling the matter." Dave clenched his jaw. The way Warren spoke about Layla, as if she were just an inconvenience, a problem to be handled, infuriated him. "That's not true," Dave said, his voice steady. He turned to Mrs. Caldwell. "Layla has been mistreated by Principal Warren for months. He's kept her out of class. He's punished her unfairly. And now," Dave hesitated, glancing at the little girl beside him, "something happened in that bathroom that scared her. I heard her scream before she ran out." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Caldwell's face remained unreadable, but Dave could see the way she was assessing the situation. "Layla," she said gently, crouching down to the girl's level, "can you tell me what happened?" Layla hesitated, her small hands gripping the hem of her sweater. For a moment, Dave worried she wouldn't say anything, that the fear would win. But then, "He grabbed my wrist," she whispered, "and he told me I don't belong here." The murmurs grew louder. "Layla, has he done this before?" Mrs. Caldwell pressed. Layla nodded, blinking back tears. "He makes me wait outside the classroom. He says I have to go in last. And when I try to talk, he tells me to stop making trouble." Mrs. Caldwell's lips pressed into a thin line. "Warren," she said slowly, "is this true?" "Of course not." Warren scoffed, though there was an edge of nervousness in his voice now. "She's lying. She's a troubled child. She's telling the truth." Another voice broke in. Everyone turned. Eileen, the receptionist, stepped forward. "I've seen it too," she said, her voice shaking. "He treats her differently. I didn't say anything because—" She trailed off, looking ashamed. "But I should have." Warren's expression twisted in fury. "You're all being ridiculous." "Then let's prove it," Dave interrupted. Layla suddenly gasped, her eyes lighting up. "My backpack." Dave frowned. "What?" She turned to Eileen. "My backpack. The purple one in the office. I had my mom's old phone inside. I recorded him." A stunned silence filled the hallway. Mrs. Caldwell turned to Eileen, who quickly nodded and hurried toward the front office. Warren paled. And Dave? Dave knew. This was the beginning of the end for the principal. The next few moments felt like hours. Eileen returned with the purple backpack, her hands shaking as she unzipped it and pulled out an old phone. "It's locked," she said, passing it to Layla. Layla quickly entered the code, her hands trembling. She scrolled through the files, then stopped. "This one," she whispered. Mrs. Caldwell took the phone, then pressed play. At first, there was only crackling. Then, Stay outside until I say so. I don't need you making a scene in front of the others." Layla's recorded voice was barely audible. "But Enough." Warren's voice, harsh and unyielding. "You don't belong here, Layla. The sooner you learn that, the better." A collective gasp filled the hallway. The recording continued. "If you say anything, no one will believe you. So stop wasting my time." Silence. Mrs. Caldwell's expression was unreadable, but her grip on the phone tightened. "That's," Warren sputtered. "That's not." The sound of sirens cut him off. Everyone turned as two police officers stepped into the hallway. "Someone called in a report," the first officer said. Eileen lifted her chin. "I did." Warren turned red. "This is absurd. You can't." The second officer held up a hand. "Sir, we're going to need you to come with us for questioning." Layla pressed closer to Dave as Warren's protests turned into desperate pleas. But it was too late. As the officers led him away, Dave looked down at Layla. She was still shaking. But this time, it wasn't just fear. It was relief. The hallway remained eerily silent as Principal Warren was led away in handcuffs. His once commanding presence was reduced to a stammering, panicked mess, his face twisted in disbelief. The students, teachers, and staff stood frozen, watching the scene unfold like something out of a movie. Layla's small fingers curled into the fabric of Dave's sleeve as she stared at the retreating figure of the man who had tormented her for months. Her breathing was uneven, and Dave could feel the tension in her tiny frame. "It's over," he murmured softly, crouching down to her level. "You're safe now." Layla swallowed hard, her wide eyes searching his face for reassurance. "Will he come back?" she asked in a whisper, barely audible over the murmurs in the hallway. Dave shook his head. "Not after this." Just then, a pair of hurried footsteps echoed down the corridor. A man and woman pushed through the crowd, Layla's parents. Her mother, a tall woman with weary eyes, let out a sharp gasp when she saw her daughter. "Layla!" Layla turned at the sound of her name, and before she could react, her mother had scooped her into a tight embrace. "You're okay," her mother whispered into her daughter's hair, her voice thick with emotion. "Oh, my baby, you're okay." Layla's father stood stiffly beside them, his face set in a grim expression. His eyes, dark with fury, locked onto the doorway where Warren had been taken. He clenched his fists, his body shaking with barely contained rage. "That man," he started, but his wife shot him a warning look, her arms still wrapped protectively around Layla. "He's gone," Dave interjected. "And with the evidence we have, he won't be coming back." Layla's father exhaled, his shoulders heaving as he fought to compose himself. "I should have known something was wrong," he muttered, his voice laced with regret. "She kept saying she didn't want to go to school, but we thought she was just struggling to adjust." Dave placed a reassuring hand on the man's shoulder. "You weren't the only one he fooled. But she spoke up today, and that changed everything." Mrs. Caldwell, who had remained silent through the exchange, finally stepped forward. "This is far from over," she said firmly. "Principal Warren will be investigated, and there will be legal action. But beyond that, we need to take a hard look at how this school has been operating under his leadership." She turned toward the assembled staff, her sharp gaze settling on the teachers who had turned a blind eye for so long. Because he didn't do this alone. A heavy silence fell over the crowd. Some teachers shifted uncomfortably. Others lowered their heads. The weight of complicity hung thick in the air. The days that followed were filled with upheaval. News of Principal Warren's arrest spread like wildfire, and soon, students and parents came forward with their own stories. More children, especially students of color, spoke about the way they had been subtly, and sometimes blatantly, excluded under Warren's leadership. Unfair punishments, harsh treatment, and an atmosphere of quiet hostility had been their reality for years. Eileen, the receptionist, stepped forward publicly, revealing that she had witnessed Warren's behavior for some time but had been afraid to lose her job. With the weight of guilt pressing down on her, she vowed to help make things right. Teachers who had remained silent before now found the courage to admit that they, too, had noticed Warren's discriminatory actions, but had either been too afraid to challenge him or too conditioned to accept it as the way things were. Meetings were held. Parents demanded accountability. The school board promised a full investigation, not just into Warren's actions, but into the culture of the school itself. Through it all, Dave remained at Layla's side. He accompanied her to the meetings where she bravely told her story. He stood with her parents as they fought for justice. And he was there when students, many of whom had never truly acknowledged him before, approached him in the halls, thanking him for standing up when no one else did. For the first time, the invisible janitor was seen. "You're a hero," one student had told him shyly. Dave had only smiled. "No," he had said, glancing at Layla. "She is." Despite the victory, Dave knew his time at Hillcrest Academy was coming to an end. The attention that had been placed on the school, the growing movement for change, it was all necessary. But it also meant that certain people would look for someone to blame. And it was easy to blame the janitor who had stirred up trouble. The decision wasn't official, but Dave could feel it coming. Sure enough, a week after Warren's arrest, he was quietly informed that his services would no longer be required at the school. Dave wasn't surprised. He also wasn't angry. He had done what he came to do. As he packed up his things, he heard a knock at the supply closet door. Layla stood there, fidgeting with the sleeves of her sweater. "Are you really leaving?" Dave crouched down so he was at her eye level. "Yeah, kiddo, but you're going to be just fine." Layla bit her lip, then, without warning, threw her arms around his neck. "Thank you," she whispered, "for believing me." Dave smiled, his throat tightening. Always. As he walked out of the school for the last time, the crisp air filling his lungs, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Pride. Not in his job, but in the fight he had chosen, and in the little girl who had found her voice. Months passed, and the dust of the scandal at Hillcrest Academy slowly settled. But the impact of what had happened never faded. Principal Warren faced formal charges, his career and reputation in ruins. The school board, now under intense scrutiny, implemented sweeping changes, new policies, diversity training, and a zero-tolerance stance on discrimination. Some teachers resigned in shame, while others took it as an opportunity to do better. Layla's parents became vocal advocates for student rights, ensuring that no other child would have to suffer in silence. And Layla? She thrived. She walked into school each morning with her head held high, no longer afraid of the walls that had once closed in around her. She made friends, participated in class, and slowly, her laughter returned. One day, during a school assembly, she was asked to speak. With steady hands and a determined gaze, she stepped up to the microphone. She told her story, not as a victim, but as someone who had found the courage to stand up even when the world tried to silence her. As she finished, the room erupted into applause. Among the crowd, unnoticed by most, a man stood near the back of the auditorium. His work boots were scuffed, his uniform different from the one he had once worn. But the pride in his eyes was unmistakable. Dave Carter had moved on. He had found another job, another place where he could build a life. But he had returned, just for today. To see the girl who had once been too afraid to speak, now strong enough to make the world listen. As he turned to leave, he heard her voice one last time. "Thank you, Mr. Carter." He smiled, tipping his cap before disappearing into the crowd. She had found her voice. And that was the greatest victory of all. Thank you so much for sticking with us until the very end of this story. We hope it resonated with you and reminded you of the power of standing up for what's right. Layla's journey is a testament to the importance of speaking up, and Dave Carter's bravery proves that even the smallest voices can spark big change. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another powerful story like this one. Also, let us know your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done in Dave's situation? Have you ever witnessed an injustice and wanted to step in? We'd love to hear from you. Thank you again for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.